This should not exist, but it does. In the dry silence of Egyptian tombs, bodies have rested for thousands of years, preserved so perfectly that even their DNA can still speak. And when scientists finally listened, they expected a familiar story. They didn't get one. Because the genetic code extracted from several ancient Egyptian mummies did not match any known living population. Not in Africa. Not in the Middle East. Not anywhere. And that leaves us with a question that should not exist at all. Who were these people? At first, the mystery seemed simple. Ancient Egypt, after all, has always been placed neatly on the map, Northeast Africa, connected to neighboring civilizations through trade, war, and migration. Historians long assumed that modern Egyptians would carry the genetic legacy of their ancestors. That assumption feels reasonable. Civilizations rise and fall, but people remain. DNA, in theory, is continuity. But when researchers began comparing mummy DNA to modern populations, something didn't line up. Modern Egyptians showed strong genetic links to sub-Saharan Africa and the broader Middle East. The mummies did not. Instead, their DNA appeared closer to ancient populations from the eastern Mediterranean regions like the Levant. At first glance, that seems like a manageable explanation. Egypt was a crossroads of ancient civilizations. Migration could account for genetic diversity. But here's where the explanation begins to slip. Because the consistency is too strong. Across multiple mummies, spanning centuries, the same genetic signature appears stable, distinct, and strangely disconnected from the people who live in Egypt today. If migration were the answer, we would expect variation. If continuity were the answer, we would expect similarity. We see neither. So the mystery deepens. Scientists began to consider other possibilities. Not just who these people were, but what might have happened to them. One theory suggests population replacement. Over thousands of years, invasions, trade routes, and shifting empires could have gradually reshaped the genetic landscape of Egypt. Romans, Arabs, and others left their mark, potentially diluting or even erasing older genetic signatures. It's plausible. History is full of such transformations. But there's a problem. Even in regions with heavy migration, genetic traces of ancient populations rarely disappear completely. They fade, they blend, but they remain. Here, the gap feels unusually sharp. Another theory looks not at replacement, but at selection. Perhaps the mummies we've studied do not represent the general population at all. Many of them were elites, priests, nobles, individuals with access to mummification. What if they belonged to a distinct subgroup? A lineage set apart. Genetically, socially, even geographically? That would explain the consistency. But it raises a different question. If they were separate, where did they come from? A third idea moves even further from comfort. It suggests that ancient Egypt may have been far more genetically complex than we imagine. Not a single people, but a layered civilization, multiple populations coexisting, interacting, and leaving behind fragments of themselves in ways we still don't fully understand. In this view, the mummies are not anomalies. They are evidence of a lost structure. And then came a study that pushed the mystery into sharper focus. Using advanced sequencing techniques, researchers were able to extract and analyze genome-wide data from mummies dating back over 1,000 years. Institutions with strict contamination controls verified the results. The data was clean, reliable, and deeply unsettling. Because it confirmed what earlier hints had suggested. These individuals were genetically closer to ancient Near Eastern populations than to modern Egyptians. Not slightly. Significantly. And perhaps more importantly, the genetic continuity we expected simply wasn't there. This wasn't a small discrepancy. It was a break. But the real twist is not that the DNA is different. It's why. Because the deeper scientists looked, the more it became clear that this isn't just a story about Egypt. It's a story about time. DNA doesn't just record ancestry. It records movement, survival, adaptation. Over thousands of years, populations shift in ways that are almost impossible to trace in a straight line. Climate changes. Empires expand. Trade routes reshape entire regions. And sometimes, the past doesn't lead cleanly into the present. It branches. It disappears. It leaves behind echoes instead of answers. Imagine standing in front of a mirror, expecting to see your reflection, and finding someone else instead. Not completely unfamiliar, but not you. That's what this discovery feels like. For a long time, we've thought of history as a continuous thread. A line that connects ancient people to modern ones in a way that feels stable, almost predictable. But the DNA of these mummies suggests something different. That continuity is fragile. That entire populations can shift so dramatically that their genetic identity becomes almost unrecognizable. And that the people who built one of the greatest civilizations in human history may not be as closely related to its modern inhabitants as we once believed. So the mystery remains. Not because we lack data, but because the data challenges the story we've been telling. And perhaps that is the most important part. Because it forces us to reconsider a deeper question. When we look into the past, are we really looking at ourselves? Or at something that only looks familiar from a distance? This is where the story becomes even more unsettling. Because if the DNA doesn't connect the way we expect, then our timeline might not either. For decades, archaeology has built a narrative of ancient Egypt as a continuous civilization evolving, adapting, but always rooted in the same land, the same people. Dynasties changed, rulers rose and fell, but the foundation remained intact. That's the story. But DNA doesn't follow stories. It follows evidence. And the evidence suggests something far less stable. When scientists expanded their comparisons, looking beyond Egypt and into surrounding regions, they noticed something subtle but important. The genetic profile of these mummies wasn't just different from modern Egyptians. It was consistently aligned with a very specific ancient population cluster that itself no longer exists in pure form today. In other words, the mummies belong to a genetic world that has largely disappeared. Not migrated. Not evolved smoothly. But fragmented. This raises a possibility that feels almost counterintuitive. What if ancient Egypt wasn't a genetic endpoint, but a temporary convergence? A place where different ancient populations met, mixed, and stabilized for a time before being reshaped again by later waves of history. That would explain the consistency in the mummies. And the disconnect with the present. But it introduces a deeper complication. Because if that's true, then the Egypt we study, the monuments, the language, the culture may have been created by a population that no longer exists in a recognizable form anywhere on Earth. Not vanished overnight, but slowly dissolved into the genetic flow of history. And here's where things take an even more interesting turn. When researchers analyzed later Egyptian remains, closer to the Roman and post-Roman periods, they began to see a shift. A gradual increase in sub-Saharan African ancestry, blending into the genetic landscape. Not sudden, but steady. Like a tide coming in. This suggests that the genetic identity of Egypt didn't break all at once. It changed direction. Which means the real mechanism behind this mystery isn't a single event like an invasion or replacement. It's something quieter. Something more persistent. Long-term gene flow. Over centuries, small movements of people, traders, settlers, families, can reshape an entire population. Not dramatically in one generation, but inevitably over many. And Egypt, positioned at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, was uniquely exposed to this process. It didn't just experience history. It absorbed it. So the DNA of the mummies isn't alien or unexplainable. It's a snapshot. A preserved moment from a version of Egypt that existed before later layers were added. But even that explanation doesn't fully settle the feeling that something is off. Because we expect continuity to feel visible, traceable, comforting. Instead, what we find is discontinuity that feels almost invisible until you look at the data. I remember the first time I came across this idea. How a civilization can remain in the same place, build on the same foundations, speak descendants of the same language, and yet, biologically, become something quite different. It forces you to rethink identity itself. Is a civilization defined by its people? Or by its culture? Or by something even less tangible: memory, continuity, shared meaning? Because if the people change, but the civilization continues, what exactly is being preserved? And what is being lost? In the end, the DNA of Egyptian mummies doesn't give us a clean answer. It gives us a more precise question. Not who were they, but how much of the past actually survives into the present? Because the truth is, history is not a straight line. It's a layering process. And sometimes, the deeper layers don't connect to the surface the way we expect. They remain buried, intact, silent, waiting for someone to notice that they don't quite belong to the world above them.